So, Ant, what is depression?
It's a great question. And probably the best way of answering it is to say what it's not before I say what it is. So for the last 40 years, we've all operated from the medical model, this idea that depression and all related psychological or psychiatric conditions are the result of abnormal firing of brain circuits. That's really the idea. So, if you ask most people for a long time, what is depression? They'll say, well, depression is what happens when you have too little serotonin running through the circuits in your brain. And intriguingly, as recently as 2022, an article was published in the Journal of Molecular Psychiatry. And what this journal did was it looked at an umbrella systematic review, which is a study of all of the studies to see if there's any consistent evidence of this being true. And what they found was astounding, that there is no consistent evidence to indicate that a deficit of serotonin correlates with depression. In fact, what the study found was there's a lot of evidence to suggest that people using antidepressants actually reduces serotonin in their brain long term. So it might even do the opposite. So what's amazing about that is that depression is very clearly not a misfiring of brain circuitry. It is not a neurological abnormality, and therefore it is not a disease in the traditional sense. It's not this endogenous entity. It's not this thing that happens inside of you and to you. It is a part of human experience. So why that's important is because that shatters a lot of the way that people have thought about depression, and it shatters a lot about the way people treat depression. This study, as much as it was profound, didn't exactly raise the eyebrows of a lot of psychologists or psychiatrists, because a lot of us, just by virtue of spending enough time with human beings, kind of already knew it. So if that's what it's not, what is it? Well, as early as the early 1900s, Sigmund Freud, the great psychoanalytic theorist, wrote a really interesting paper called Mourning and Melancholia. And the reason this paper was so intriguing was because he was one of the first persons to remark upon the similarities of mourning or grief processes to depression. So what he would say is that when we talk about a human being as being depressed, we often say that you're sad more days than not. You feel inappropriate guilt, low self-esteem. You don't find pleasure in things. You have low motivation. You have disruptions in your sleep and your eating patterns. You might even feel suicidal. And he says, well, very often we feel this way when we lose someone we love. When we go into grief or mourning, we could feel those exact same sensations. But depression is not the same as mourning. And so he said, well, there's mourning, and then there must be a thing that we'll call melancholia, which is the old term for depression. And what's interesting is that we've gone on this long journey of all the thoughts we had about depression, and intriguingly, we've kind of circled back to that exact same understanding that he suggested all those years ago. And what we now understand happens is precisely what he argues in this paper, where he says, what happens in grief is that you lose someone in the world, and the world feels poorer for it. What happens in depression is you lose a part of yourself and you feel poorer for it. There is something intrinsically valuable to you in your life that is no longer present, and as a result, you feel these feelings. So very often, what we now argue is that depression is better understood as an emotional response to loss. And it's not necessarily a loss of something physical in the world. It can be a loss of a more ideal kind. There are so many versions of what you could lose. You could lose meaningful work. You could lose play or meaningful leisure. You could lose valuable relationships, not to death, but just because they end. Those could be romantic relationships, friendships. You could lose a certain future that you'd envisioned for yourself. You could make a mistake and lose a version of yourself that you prized because you acted not in a manner that's in accordance with your values. You could lose a connection to nature. You could lose a connection to your past, to your heritage. You could experience a whole range of losses that could impact on you without you realizing it and cultivate a deep sadness that you carry with you.
I have to draw a connection to the addiction discussion we just had, because you could also lose your substance of choice when you quit. It's like, yes, your brain may well be in a dopamine deficit state, but there is no question that an addict is deeply mourning the pleasure that he or she is no longer going to be partaking in. Very interesting.
Absolutely. There's definitely a grief that comes along with that. And it's worth noting that that's often what depression is about. Depression is often summarized using words like disconnection, absence, or loss. Where the confusion comes in for a lot of people is that sometimes depression is about losing something that you used to have. In other cases, depression can also be never having something that you really need.
So where do you go to start sort of diagnosing root cause here?
Well, very often when you start to look at someone who's experiencing depression, what you're often looking for is what they have in their life, but also you want to look at what's missing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when we think of that latter kind of depression, technically it's often referred to as anaclitic depression. It's a depression of absence. I've met people who will say to me, you know, and I've actually got everything I want. I've got a wonderful relationship. I've got a good job. I've got lots of money. I've got kids. I've got fun hobbies, but I feel depressed. And intriguingly, very often you'll find for those people that I'm discussing, there was a loss of a more symbolic or ideal kind. Some people get depressed when they accomplish all of their goals and they no longer have challenges or dreams towards which to strive.
They've lost the challenge.
They've lost the challenge. I had the fortune of working with someone who's a really lovely person. He's one of the few billionaires I've met in my life. And he was always gracious and said, "You're very welcome to share my story," because that was precisely what happened to him. He was so much happier when he had to struggle for things. And he mentioned to me, he said, once he actually got there and he had everything he could ever wanted, he got depressed. He said, "There's no challenge, there's no struggle, nothing's difficult for me." And when we started to understand that together, we realized that what we have to do is we have to make your life difficult again, man.
This life's fucking brutal, isn't it? It's like you do all the fucking work only to realize you got to find something else to go and suffer for.
It's exactly that. But what he could really live with was, he said, and what he liked about it, he said, but now I get a choice over what I'm going to suffer for. And it was so funny because once he had these challenges back, he was happier.
He was really happy, yeah. Yeah.
He really liked it.
There's this author, Mark Manson. I don't know if you've ever read any of his stuff. He wrote the book, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. He talks about, it's not that you don't want problems, it's that you just want better problems.
It's exactly it. It's such a good line.
Yeah. So, what I was going to ask you about is actually like this, what I learned about of depression from Jordan Peterson, which is, you know, someone comes to him, the first thing he does is essentially diagnose their lives, right? It's like life is really difficult. It's like if someone's got a really tough life, like no wonder you're depressed, right? But it actually sounds like that's kind of all you do when someone comes to you with depression is look at your life and let's look at what's missing. And it is really just a practical thing of diagnosing what's been lost. It might be a little bit more abstract for somebody like a billionaire than somebody who, like, objectively, for example, has no friends, right?
Exactly.
Right. But the process is the same.
It's very much so. And if I can build on that, because Jordan Peterson, I think, has a lovely way of saying that when he says diagnose your life. What's fulfilling you and what's absent? Because what's really helpful about the way that he works and the way that so many therapists work is that you work really realistically. I think one of the things that he often says that I quite like is he says, I don't find it difficult to understand why people are depressed and anxious. I find it amazing if you're not feeling that way because life is really challenging.
Actually, what he says is, it's not one of the other things he says, it's not a mystery why people do cocaine. The mystery is why people aren't doing cocaine all day, every day, nonstop.
It's totally true. That's absolutely sagacious. You're right. And that's what you're looking at. Sometimes you'll find that, as you say, the loss is abstract and it's complex, and that's where we get stuck. But you'll often find that for many people, the loss is multifactorial. So for instance, you might be really stressed and be overworking, and that's what you think your problem is. But it's not actually that you're overworking because you find meaning in what you do. It's that in the process of that, you lost connection to meaningful leisure, you spent less time in your relationship that rewards you, you don't sleep enough, you don't eat enough. There are losses that come with the stresses that are created. And so even though it sounds really simple to say, let's look at what's lost, there's this rich tapestry that you're suggesting is there that we often need someone else to help us uncover because there are so many layers behind it.
My next question is, why is psilocybin a good fit for treating depression? And I was going to answer it, but I'm going to let you answer it because it's just based on a conversation of addiction. It's just so interesting how these things all tie beautifully together. So why is psilocybin a good fit for treating depression?
So the answer that a lot of people would have thought is the reason is they'd say, well, we always thought that psilocybin works to help depression because we think depression means you have too little serotonin. So if we give you psilocybin that's got lots of serotonin, that makes you feel better. But that's not true. What psilocybin does is it acts as a catalyst for personal reflection that will help you spot the things that you're missing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And not only will you spot them, but you'll feel their absence for the first time. You'll really long for them. You'll really pine for them. And I can't tell you how often that comes up for people. You know, very often when we're experiencing a psilocybin journey, we find ourselves grieving. If there was a loss that we'd had, we mourn it. We cry it out in a way that feels like we create resolution and we're okay with it. But that's our grief. Our melancholia, on the other hand, we start to really miss the things that we really loved, and we really realize it because all those things bubbling under the surface come there. I've heard so many people who go, Anthony, I couldn't stop thinking about my wife. I've missed her. I haven't connected with her in so long, and I've realized I'm sad because I miss all of these amazing memories we used to have, or I miss connecting with my friend, or I miss my kid, or I miss this. And those longings come to the surface and you finally feel reconnected. What's also amazing about it is that in depression, it's not just the loss of those things. It's like we lose parts of ourselves. And very often we use the word recovery when we talk about therapy. And recovery is a lovely word because you're recapturing something, you're getting something back. And when your brain is hyper-connected using psilocybin, it's almost like you're bundling up all these experiences, thoughts, memories, and parts of yourself to reunite them all together again and then help you get what you really need in your life. And so psilocybin becomes an amazing conduit to help foster those insights and those feelings to direct you towards meeting what you really need. Because if you do so, that really alleviates your depression.
Why is our psyche constructed this way? And why is it that we sometimes need an exogenous substance to help us uncover insights into our minds? It seems like a quirk. Like surely we should have these kinds of insights so we can meet our needs more effectively.
It's one of the most profound questions that you're asking. And I mean, obviously psychologists and neuroscientists ask it a lot, but for me as well, I've been reflecting on that a lot lately, where I was saying to my wife, Nina, the other day, I said to her, we are an absurd species. We are an absurd species because we constantly need help meeting our own needs that we should know about.
Exactly.
Like, what is wrong with us? and so what you're saying is so true. And when you look at the answer to it, it does actually make sense. When we're kids, we usually have a pretty sound grasp of what feels good and what doesn't, but we don't always know fully what we need. We're heavily reliant on other people to tell us what's right and what's wrong. And as any parent will tell you, it's incredibly complicated to know what the right thing to do with a young child is. Because many times the message you send is not the message they receive.
Yeah.
And so what happens is, when we're kids, we've got a whole range of needs. We've got all these different needs. We've got all these different things we want. We've got all these different things we crave. And we try to meet our needs all of the time. And the person who's going to tell us which strategy is okay and which one is not is usually our caregiver. It's our attachment figure. And that's a hell of a responsibility, because our poor old attachment figure doesn't always know exactly what's going on in those moments and can't anticipate all of the consequences.
And they're bringing their own biases to the table as well, and their own issues and stuff. So if the road to hell is paved with with best intentions, right? So
exactly it. So what happens is we build strategies that work in those relationships. And very often that meets certain needs, but it comes at the expenses of others. And we get fixated on meeting certain needs because those get us by. So we build mental models of what we should be doing and what we really need. And we don't question these models because we build them to automate them so that we can deal with life's complexities.
Yeah.
But what we all forget is that very often our model is incomplete. It's incomplete and it's distorted. And it's in need of revision. But when do we revise anything? Only when problems occur. And the problem grows and grows and grows. And now we're going, okay, the model's not working. I need a new model. And that's really difficult to do. But when you've got something like psilocybin, it gives you this profound insight into where the model's going wrong. It'll tell you what you really need. But then you'll be left in a position to go, great, but now I need a new model. And that's where therapy comes in, where it says, great, now that we know where it was going wrong, now I can teach you new models that we can add on, we can elaborate on, and we can build a more robust, a more sophisticated framework so that we can meet the old needs that you're already meeting, but also meet some of the unmet ones and help you live a more fulfilling life. Because as many people will tell you, when all your needs are truly fulfilled and met, you're not really capable of feeling depressed.
Yeah.
Myself and colleagues are yet to meet someone in that position.
It's actually so beautiful the way it's constructed by whomever or whatever constructed it, because it's that model of the caregiver to the child and the way our mind automates things so it can get through the world. That probably actually works for as long as it's a healthy parent-child relationship. It probably works for 90% of things. And then thank God there is this beautiful substance or these substances out there. And what's so exciting about the psychedelic renaissance, that you've got these medicines that can actually help, what do they call it? Reopen the learning windows that we have, right? So it's like, cool, these models worked fantastically for the first 35 years of my life. Take this medicine and then enter into, you probably butcher me for saying this, but maybe another type of parent-child relationship with a therapist to craft better strategies. So it's kind of like you've got a mechanism to update, basically, right? You've actually got this mechanism to update that isn't reliant on you becoming a child again in order to build those neural circuitries. So it's actually quite beautiful.
No, man, I don't think you butchered that at all. That's very much the way it would be understood.
So you may have answered this already, but okay, so the psilocybin helps with the insight into what's missing, and I'll just ask it anyway. Why is the therapy so important?
Well, I think it's because the therapy shows you the path to get to what you want. Psilocybin is really profound in showing you what you really need. Therapy is really effective at trying to help you get there. And therapy is valuable in this respect for two reasons. One, because very often, even though we know what we need, we don't know what we're supposed to do. So I might say to you, James, I want 10% body fat. That doesn't mean I have a freaking clue as to how I accomplish that. But I could go talk to someone who happens to know a lot about how you do it, and he's going to teach me the way. So now that I've got my insights, I need some tools from somebody who's an expert. And whether it's our biology, whether it's our financial well-being, whether it's our medical needs, our life needs require knowledge too. And that's where therapy becomes useful, because there are a lot of profound scientific insights that have been developed by very clever people and studied very thoroughly that can be handed to us at our disposal and uniquely tailored to our needs to offer us a genuine roadmap that's catered to us. And the best part about that is that rather than it feeling too robotic, what you get with that roadmap is a relationship with someone who genuinely cares about you, unconditionally accepts you, and will support you the whole way through as long as is needed to make sure that you get what you need. And having that kind of a relationship paired with the knowledge base that it affords you is a really useful and valuable route And that's why emphasizing the relationship is not wrong, because that becomes a really lovely way of trying to achieve what you need. Without having that roadmap and that relationship, you're often left with insight without action. And insight without knowledge can't really get you much. It gets you a beautiful experience, but it doesn't become a sustainable one. And what therapy does is it takes a transcendent experience and translates it into your everyday life so that it's a feeling you can keep having, that it's a need you can keep meeting, and so that this experience endures long beyond the mystical one occasioned by the psychedelic.
And where do you draw, you used the example of 10% body fat. So where do you draw a clear distinction between therapy and coaching? Is it that all therapists are coaches, but not all coaches are therapists?
Well put. That would be how it would be understood. And I wouldn't want to do a disservice to coaches, but the way I would understand the difference is that coaches will focus on helping you shift behaviors. Where therapy is distinct is that psychologists spend probably an inordinate amount of time not just understanding what behaviors are effective, but we spend an incredible amount of time understanding the complexity of the originating experiences, the personality dynamics beneath them, so that rather than just saying, I do this, but I need to do that, we can create a roadmap that says, I do this because of this, it came from here, this is why it's important, and this is how I can do it differently.
Very interesting. It helped me think, helps me think about it more clearly. It's really a root cause diagnosis plus the behavioral change.
Precisely.
Yeah. So why is equanimity programming a good fit for people with depression?
Well, I think for a few reasons. One is that what I think is beautiful about the way that we structure our retreats is that first and foremost, you are encased into a situation where you're put in a beautiful healing setting with like-minded people who demonstrate compassion, kindness, and genuine interest in you. One of the things that we often struggle with in depression, which I think is one of the predominant causes that people experience these days, is that as much as we are more connected digitally, we're not necessarily more connected intimately. And getting to have experiences like these become rarer and rarer for people, to get to be vulnerable and connect with people in really sincere ways. Our retreat offers you an opportunity not just to connect with guides that way, but to connect with each other that way. I mean, we've been repeatedly amazed by the fact that some of the best elements of the retreats have been the friendships and genuine enduring relationships that people have forged in the course of these healing experiences, which I think in and of itself is curative and helpful to people. The other reason that it's amazing is because you're not just going to get insights into yourself through the therapeutic framework, but you're going to be enriched by a lot of experiences. Very often we're depressed because we've almost lost a connection with the beauty of the world around us, and our retreat locations reintroduce you to that in a profound way. But we also almost disconnect from our bodies and the nature of novel experiences. And getting to do things like breath work, yoga, meditation, and importantly, cold exposure almost re-engages you into a place of novelty, of new learning, of new experience, of getting to see that your body and your mind can do things you never thought they could do, even before you go into journey, which I think is profoundly useful to people. Then, of course, the highlight very much is the psychedelic experience, which again will help you re-examine your life, your relationships, and your world with deep love, deep compassion, allow you to mourn losses, gain insights, and then, of course, you spend the remainder of the retreat constructing a plan that's just for you on how you can live differently when you get out of there. And we found that because we spend so much time on integration, on translating insights into behaviors, and of course, walking a road with you over the next 6 months, we find that instead of having this beautiful experience that you then wither away within a month, you find that 6 months later, it wasn't just a flash in the pan. It was a sustainable change that you carried through in your life and your relationships in a prolonged way. And that's what's really special about the program, because you won't just feel temporary relief from depression. you'll be able to radically and fundamentally change it. So that even if I spoke to you 2 to 3 years later, as we often do with people that we're working with, you'll still be able to say that I still feel so much better than where I was, rather than just returning back to it unintentionally.
Other thing I think is really key to emphasize is that, not to get too morbid, but I suppose this is a discussion on depression, so it's probably appropriate, but life's fucking hard. And, if somebody comes on retreat and is struggling to build fulfilling relationships in their lives, that is not a problem that can be solved quickly. And it does require some help. And you guys provide that help and support on tackling just more difficult problems that people will have to go back to solve, as opposed to
I like
symptom relief. Yeah,
exactly, because I think what you're saying is important. Life is hard, and it's not going to stop being hard. So rather than just create a moment where it was blissful, let's create that moment where it was blissful, but then let's make sure that even though life will keep being hard, you've got a whole new different way of engaging that. And you've got a supportive function from people who actually care about you to help you keep doing so.
For people suffering from depression specifically, is there anyone who isn't a fit for coming on retreat?
So it's important, because there would be 2 areas where we would say it might be unhelpful to somebody. So when I'm thinking of depression specifically, the first thing that you'd have to be wary of is that many people who are suffering from depression are on antidepressants. And antidepressants happen to be one of the things that will dampen the effects of a psychedelic and make it less effective to somebody. This is not to suggest that you can't come on retreat if you're on antidepressants. It's merely to suggest that there would be a window where we would have to wean you down off of these things, and you'd have to keep that timeline in mind for yourself as you're planning to come on retreat so that you could do it. So if you're on antidepressants, we would have our lovely psychiatrist and any medical professionals helping us titrate your medications to the right doses so that it would be possible for you. So it means you might not be able to do it immediately, but you might have to do it a little bit later. That would be the one thing to keep in mind. For people who are depressed, there is only one time where people will really struggle to manage a lot of what we're doing. If you're acutely suicidal in that moment and feel like you're high risk to yourself, it can sometimes be challenging to go through a retreat of this nature. Very often, we have found that there is a different psychedelic medicine that works for people who are acutely suicidal, which is ketamine, which can rapidly and effectively reduce suicidal tendencies almost instantly. It's not to say that psilocybin can't do the same, but rather that we'd want you as stable as we could have you before you came on retreat. Yeah. So very often.
That's a really good advice for people. So it's like if they want to do this, they could also do ketamine. Of course, it's legal in most geographies, so they could do it in their own in their own home environment where they'll be looked after by medical professionals who are close to them as they titrate off their current medications to ketamine, get some relief, and then come when they're more stable.
That's exactly right. And the last one would be a similar process, but that's if someone is experiencing catatonic depression, where you're so depressed that you're almost immobile or shut down. Very often, that could mean it will be challenging for you to participate effectively in the retreat. Yeah. So very often, again, we would recommend the same process of ketamine can kind of almost help jumpstart, as can things like ECT or electroconvulsive therapy help jumpstart you, so that, as one person put it who went through that process, ketamine can bring you back to life, and psilocybin will show you how to live.
Any advice for people who are suffering, like right now, and things that they could do immediately outside of something like ketamine therapy to help sort of alleviate their symptoms?
Absolutely. One of the most profound and effective things that we've seen happen for people is one that keeps getting studied over and over again. And I read a recent republication of a study that deals with exactly this. They did a big study again comparing every different intervention we've got for depression. And they wanted to look at them. And they excluded psychedelic therapies on this one. But they said, let's take 5 different traditional therapies 5 different traditional antidepressants and a couple of lifestyle interventions, and let's just see which one works best. And amongst them, the one that stood out perhaps the strongest, and by quite a margin, was exercise. Exercise remains the most profound and effective means outside of psychedelic experiences to really start catalyzing and mobilizing. It's very, very important that when you're depressed and you're struggling, that going back to basics of getting sufficient sleep, 8 hours, no longer, no less, if you can help it, eating regularly and enough, particularly when it comes to carbohydrates, and exercising, even if that means you have a loved one or a support dragging you to do the bare minimum, it can make more of a difference than you often realize. The small steps can be powerful and connecting. Another important one is often recognizing the value of relationships. When we're depressed, very often our inclination is to isolate, to run away. And if you can build up the courage to be able to connect and be vulnerable, it can often be really rewarding to be couched in supportive relationships. Connecting with people, connecting with your body, and doing the right things to care for yourself can be meaningful first steps very often on a broader road to recovery.
Do you have any examples of someone who was diagnosed with depression that went through our program that you could share with people?
Absolutely. I mean, there are many, many, many different ones. But the one that I'll use is someone, of course, I'm not using his information, but he was very kind to say I could share his story. He was a man who was completely socially isolated. He had not spent time with friends. He was very seldom seeing his own children. He was on the verge of divorce. He was deeply, deeply depressed. So depressed, in fact, that he went into a state of catatonia. He was immobile and mute. He was taken for psychiatric review, and we recommended initially that he should go on ketamine treatment, which he said brought him back to life. It was like a jump start. And once he had enough energy to re-engage, he realized the necessity of changing his life. And so he came on retreat. What was really remarkable for him was that he benefited in all the ways that I've described earlier. He said, one, it felt fantastic for him to be amongst human beings where he didn't feel alien or isolated, where he actually felt cared for and had shared experiences because other people were vulnerable, made him feel far, far more normal than he'd felt in a long time. Secondly, he got to experience things he never otherwise knew could exist. And just being reminded that his body could do things that he didn't realize was powerful to him. Cold exposure was by far a standout. He said something really funny while we were in an ice bath. And he'd actually said to me, he said, listen, ketamine's great, but it can suck it. Ice baths are way better. Which was really profound. And it was special to him because what's really nice when you go through retreats, especially if you're depressed, is you get reacquainted with hope. Wow, there are things that I didn't realize could happen, and maybe there's a chance I can get better. In the course of his journey, what was really, really profound for him, at least, was that when he experienced it, he realized all of the things that he'd lost. He had become so fixated on being financially successful, which of course he was, that he realized that it had come at the expense of all of the things that he actually loved and valued.
Yeah.
And when he went through his experience, he pined for them again for the first time. And in so doing, felt like he really wanted to connect to them. And the day after his journey, he called his wife, and I think they spoke for 3 hours. And he'd said that he felt like it was the first time that he had spoken to his wife in 7 years. He had shared space with her, but he had not been intimate or vulnerable or connected to her. And he had never been happier. What's amazing is this happened 2 years ago. And even when we see each other now, he's happy. He's got new hobbies. He's a master of Lego, which he never thought he would like, but he absolutely loves.
That's such a cool story, hey? Just these little things. Yeah.
These little things make a big difference to us. And that's often what it's about, is realizing that very often the insight you'll come out with sometimes sounds very basic of, I've realized for the first time how much I love, for example, my wife or something like that. But to truly feel it and to truly know it is the challenge. And that's what these kinds of programs do. And when we used our framework for him, when we regulated his sleep, his exercise, his diet, when we created measurable ways of doing things for him, of you're going to spend these times with your wife, this is going to be routinized in the way that you do these behaviors, these are the times you're going to spend time with your kids, once a week you're going to make sure
back to creating a real structure, real structure around the open experience. It's the insight, and now here's the structure. Here's how you're going to actually implement it in your life. It's very powerful.
It's exactly that. I mean, true to him, he compared it where he said what was special to him was that the insights were wonderful, but he said he would have otherwise churned around not knowing what to do with them.
Yeah.
So when we talked about the framework, when we built this framework, he said to me, what I like about this is, ironically, it's a lot like Lego. He's like, what you've given me is psilocybin showed me the Ferrari that I want to build. It showed me what I want at the end. And what you've done through your therapy is you've created the little booklet that says, put this piece on here, then put this piece on here so that I could get there. And fortunately, he built it.
And I can just talk from personal experience in the modern world. It's like we are just so bombarded with shit that if we don't have, coming back to this, just structure and discipline, we're just a leaf in the wind, right? It's just we're just literally blown away by all of the complexities of modern life. The other thing I want to just double click on, actually, for people who are really suffering, is the cold exposure. Just in general, I've literally found the reason. I mean, I could talk about this for 30 minutes, but I'll keep it brief. The reason it's such a powerful intervention for immediate symptom relief is that it's only 2 minutes or 1 minute of your day. So it's like, no matter how depressed you are or anxious you are or shitty you feel, most people can say, you know what, I can do it for a minute. I have a minute of energy in me. The activation energy is just so low in order to do it. And what I've said is, it's the biggest ROI out of any meditation, exercise, anything. It's the biggest ROI because of how little time is needed and what a massive impact it has on one state. It's just incredibly powerful. So yeah, so for anyone who's suffering, get an ice bath or a cold shower. It will provide immediate relief. And I think, and that's it. I mean, is there anything else you'd like to share on depressions and psychedelics, or just depression in general?
I think probably the only thing to say would be that often what depression involves is a loss of hope. You know, one of the things that I find interesting when you speak to someone who's depressed is it's almost like they've lost sight of the future. They're so caught up in the past, they're so caught up in what's missing that they can't see what's ahead of them. And it's amazing what can happen to a human being when you give them hope. So when you're depressed, one of the most important things for you to do is look for something that can give you hope. And if you can't find it, find someone who will. Because just someone giving you that knowledge can make you bear a lot more than you thought and get you through it. And so finding hope, I think, is a very powerful tool from positive psychology on how you can start to at least begin that journey and stay in it long enough to get to the end.